Indiana, United States. September 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 4 months. The flags had come down, the surrender documents had been signed, and the machinery of a continent was slowly, painfully learning how to stop. Across the Atlantic, in a country that had never seen a bomb fall on its own soil, the processing camps were filling, not with soldiers, but with women. Clerks, nurses, administrators, auxiliaries. Women who had served a collapsing order and now stood on foreign ground, waiting to find out what the victors did with the people they had defeated. The first thing Ilse Baumann noticed was the sky. Not the guards. Not the fences. Not the American soldiers standing at the gate with their rifles held loosely at their sides, the way men hold weapons when they are not afraid of the people in front of them. The first thing she noticed, stepping off the transport bus onto the flat gravel of the processing yard, was how much sky there was. In Stuttgart, the sky had always been interrupted by rooftops, church spires, the hills that rose behind the old city and caught the light in the late afternoon. Even after the bombing, perhaps especially after, the skyline was broken things. Half-walls, chimney stacks standing alone, the skeletal frames of buildings that had held families and now held nothing. You learned to read the gaps. You learned to measure what was missing by the shape of what remained. Here there was nothing to interrupt. Flat land in every direction, stretching to a horizon so distant it seemed theoretical. Cornfields, already harvested, their dry stalks pale gold in the September light. Farmhouses set back from the road with smoke rising from their chimneys in thin, unhurried columns. A water tower in the distance with a town's name painted in letters she could not read from this distance. Roads without craters. Fences that marked property lines, not battle lines. She stood on the gravel and breathed and did not move until the woman behind her said, quietly, "Ilse, we have to keep walking." She walked. Her name was Ilse Baumann, 34 years old. Born in Stuttgart in the autumn of 1911, the second daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who had kept the household running with the particular efficiency of someone who understood that order was a form of love. She had grown up in a Germany still reconstructing itself from the First War, still carrying its humiliation like a stone in the chest, still searching for an explanation that would make the suffering mean something. She had found that explanation, the way most people her age had found it, gradually, then completely, the way water finds the lowest point in a field. Not through violence or coercion, but through the patient accumulation of a world that agreed with itself. Teachers who taught one version of history. Youth organizations that turned loyalty into something that felt like joy. Neighbors who believed the same things, said the same things, raised their children on the same stories. When everyone around you inhabits the same version of reality, it stops feeling like a version. It just feels like the world. She had believed it. She would not pretend otherwise, not even now, not even here. She had believed that Germany was being restored to what it deserved to be. She had believed that the order being built around her was protection, not machinery. She had believed that strength and discipline and sacrifice were the currencies of survival, and that a country willing to demand all three of its people was a country serious about their future. She had raised her son on those beliefs. Friedrich, 17 years old when the last winter of the war arrived. Narrow shoulders, a serious expression that was slightly too old for his face, the particular gravity of a boy who has decided that becoming a man is a project requiring constant effort. He had her dark hair and his father's gray eyes. His father who had died in the 4th year of the war on the Eastern Front, in weather so cold that the official notification had felt almost redundant, as if the temperature itself had already delivered the news. Friedrich had wanted to study medicine, had spent the last years of the war reading whatever books he could find on biology and chemistry, filling notebooks with careful diagrams of the human circulatory system, asking her questions about the body that she could not always answer. He had not wanted to fight. He had told her this once, quietly, in the kitchen of their apartment in the winter of 1944, when the drafts were reaching younger and younger boys, and the news from every front had taken on the particular quality of information that the state was no longer confident enough to falsify convincingly. "I don't want to go," he had said, not with rebellion in his voice. With something sadder, the simple statement of a boy who understood that what he wanted had stopped mattering some time ago. She had told him what she had been trained to tell him. That duty was not a choice, but a condition of belonging. That sacrifice was how a generation proved itself worthy of the country it would inherit. That the men at the front needed every capable body, and a boy who loved medicine would one day have the chance to heal people if he first helped defend the world they would live in. She had believed those words when she said them. That was the part she could not stop thinking about, lying awake in the barracks at night with the Indiana darkness pressing against the windows, that she had believed them. Not because she had been forced to. because the world she had lived in for 30 years had built those words into her the way a carpenter builds load-bearing walls, so deep into the structure that you do not see them holding the roof up until the day you finally look. Friedrich had left in February 1945. She had watched him walk down the stairs of their building with a pack that was too large for his frame, and turn at the bottom to look back at her one more time. She had kept her face composed, because she had been taught that composure was a form of strength you gave to the people you loved. She had not heard from him since. The processing center was a collection of low wooden buildings arranged around a central yard. Everything was functional, organized, clean in the impersonal way of institutions that process large numbers of people and have learned that efficiency and basic dignity are not incompatible. There were guards, but they were not cruel. There were fences, but they were not the kind that communicated punishment. More like the kind that communicated administration, the marking of a boundary that existed because boundaries were how large systems kept track of where things were. Ilsa had been prepared for something different. In the final weeks before the surrender, when it became clear that the war was ending in the worst possible way, the officers had gathered the women still attached to the apparatus, clerks, administrators, auxiliary staff, and explained what to expect. The tone had been controlled, almost clinical, but underneath it ran something that was not quite fear and not quite honesty. Something like the voice of people who knew the story they were telling was already coming apart at the edges, but had not yet found a different one to replace it. The Americans take prisoners for information and for labor, one officer had said. They are not bound by the same standards they claim to uphold. In practice, women in their custody are considered spoils. Expect no legal protection. Expect no professional treatment. Expect to be used in ways consistent with what they think you deserve. Another officer, a woman in her 40s whose uniform was already showing the wear of a country that had stopped being able to replace things, had added, "Their soldiers come from a culture without discipline, without history. They have been fighting for 4 years on other people's soil, and they are angry, and they are coming here. Do not expect mercy from men who have decided you are guilty." Ilsa had filed those warnings alongside everything else she had been told about the country across the Atlantic. A place of excess without substance, of loudness without conviction, of wealth built on borrowed time, and now visibly running out. A country that had entered a European war it did not understand for reasons that had more to do with profit than principle. A country whose soldiers were soft, undisciplined, driven more by material comfort than genuine courage. That was the picture she had carried onto the transport bus. That was the lens through which she had watched Indiana come into view through the scratched window. It did not match what she was seeing. The woman who processed her paperwork was a corporal in her late 20s, efficient and unhurried, with the practiced manner of someone who had done this particular task several hundred times and had found a rhythm that was neither warm nor unkind. She worked through the forms in English, a German-American translator rendering each question into something Ilsa could answer. Name, date of birth, last known address, occupation during the conflict, any medical conditions requiring immediate attention. Ilsa answered each question. The corporal typed. A second soldier photographed her against a white wall, front, then profile, the flash bright and impersonal. At no point did anyone speak to her with contempt. At no point did anyone raise a voice, make a threat, or look at her in the way the officers had described. They were busy. They were professional. They were processing a form that needed to be completed and then filed, and she was the person standing on the other side of the desk while they completed it. It was such an ordinary thing. That was what unsettled her. She had been prepared for violence or for something that resembled it. She had not been prepared for the quiet competence of a bureaucratic system that treated her capture as an administrative event requiring documentation rather than an opportunity for any of the things she had been told to expect. The gap between the warning and the reality was not a small one. It was not a matter of degree. It was a different thing entirely. She did not allow herself to draw conclusions from it yet. One day of processing proved nothing. The real character of a place revealed itself over time, in unguarded moments, in the gap between official behavior and private behavior. She would wait. She would watch. She had always been good at watching. That first evening, they were taken to the mess hall. The room held perhaps 100 people, a mix of American personnel and the new arrivals, seated at long tables under lights that worked. The smell reached Ilsa before she crossed the threshold, and she stopped for just a moment, involuntarily, because the smell was food. Not the smell of something being stretched to serve more people than it was meant to serve. Not the smell of broth made from bones that had already given everything they had to give. The smell of actual food, cooking in actual quantities, the kind of smell that had become so unfamiliar over the last 2 years that encountering it unexpectedly was almost physically disorienting. She took a tray. She moved down the line. A soldier behind the counter, young, heavy-set, From somewhere in the American South, if his accent was any indication, ladled meat stew onto her tray with the same efficient generosity he used for everyone else. Bread, vegetables, a cup of coffee. At the end of the line, a pitcher of milk. She carried the tray to a seat and looked at it. The woman beside her, Renata, a former administrative clerk from Munich who had attached herself to Ilse during the transport with the quiet desperation of someone who needed a familiar face, whispered, "Don't eat too fast. Your stomach won't manage it." Ilse nodded. She ate slowly, methodically, the way she had been eating for 2 years, portioning each bite, making it last, the habits of scarcity operating independently of the abundance in front of her. Around her, American soldiers ate the same food, talking in the easy, overlapping way of men who were comfortable with each other, who were not afraid, who were not calculating how far this meal needed to stretch. Halfway through the stew, she set her spoon down for a moment and looked around the room. Everything here was intact. The lights, the walls, the building itself. The people in it moved without the particular economy of motion that comes from living in a place where resources are always running low. The careful walk, the measured gesture, the body's learned reluctance to expend more than necessary, because there was never certainty about what tomorrow would require. These men moved like people who had not learned that lesson. Or rather, like people who had never needed to. She picked up her spoon and continued eating and did not say anything. But she thought, they are not running out of anything. The officers had been so certain. The country across the ocean was overstretched, depleted, fighting a war on borrowed credit and borrowed morale. Any month now its true condition would surface, and the effort would collapse under its own weight. That was the story. That was the version of the world she had been handed and had carried for years without examining it too carefully. The way you carry an assumption, not in your hands where you can see it, but somewhere behind your ribs where it just feels like the shape of how things are. She looked at the pitcher of milk. She thought about Friedrich. She thought about the kitchen in Stuttgart in the last winter, the two of them eating what there was with the particular silence of people who have decided not to name the thing that is missing because naming it makes it worse. Friedrich had looked thinner every time she saw him. She had told herself it was growing. She had told herself a lot of things. She picked up the cup of coffee and held it with both hands and let the warmth move through her palms and tried not to think too much about what it meant that she was sitting here, in this intact room, eating this meal, while somewhere in the rubble of what had been Germany her son was. She did not know where her son was. That was the weight she carried everywhere. Not the uncertainty of her own situation. Not the strangeness of this country or the discomfort of captivity or even the quiet, persistent work of revising everything she thought she knew about where she was and who had brought her here. Those were manageable things. The mind adapts. The mind finds its footing. But Friedrich was 17, and she did not know if he was alive, and there was no adaptation for that. There was only the carrying of it, hour by hour, in the way that mothers carry the things they cannot fix, silently, constantly, with a steadiness that looks from the outside like composure and feels from the inside like a form of controlled drowning. She finished the coffee. She carried her tray to the return window. She walked back to the barracks in the flat Indiana dark, the stars overhead more numerous than she had ever seen them, the air smelling of dry grass and distance, the sounds of the camp settling into its nighttime rhythms behind her. She lay down on the bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought, tomorrow I will understand more. Tomorrow I will know better what this place is. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept without waking, the deep, unguarded sleep of a body that, for the first time and longer than she could clearly remember, was not cold, was not hungry, and was not listening for the sound of aircraft. She would not admit, in the morning, that this meant anything. But her body already knew. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. The days found their rhythm the way days always do, even in places you did not choose to be. Morning began with a bell at 6:30, a sound with no malice in it, just the flat, practical announcement of time moving forward. The barracks stirred. Women dressed in the gray-green work clothes the army had issued, practical and shapeless, carrying none of the particular humiliation that Ilse had expected from an enemy's uniform. They were simply clothes. Warm enough for the September mornings, which arrived cool and bright. The Indiana sky enormous and pale above the flat fields surrounding the camp. Breakfast was at 7. Then work assignments. Then the long middle hours of the day, which were stranger than the mornings because they were not filled with emergency or fear, only the quiet accumulation of ordinary things that kept refusing to match the picture she had been carrying in her mind. Ilse had been assigned to the administrative building. Light clerical work, sorting forms, copying information from handwritten intake sheets into typed records, organizing files by prisoner number and date of arrival. The work required no special skill, only patience and a legible hand, both of which she had in abundance. She sat at a desk near a window that looked out over the central yard, and she typed, and she watched, and she thought. She was good at all three. The woman at the desk beside her was a corporal named Dorothy Marsh, from a town in Ohio, whose name Ilsa could not yet pronounce correctly. Dorothy was 26 years old, with the efficient cheerfulness of someone who had decided long ago that most problems yielded to a combination of competence and good humor. She spoke no German. Ilsa spoke limited English, enough to follow simple instructions, not enough for conversation. They communicated in the way that people communicate when language runs out, carefully, with patience, using gesture and expression to fill the gaps that words could not yet bridge. On the third morning, Dorothy arrived at her desk carrying 2 cups of coffee and set one beside Ilsa's typewriter without ceremony, the way you set something down for a colleague rather than a stranger. Ilsa looked at the cup, then at Dorothy, who had already turned back to her own work and was sorting a stack of forms with the focused efficiency of someone with a long list and a limited morning. It was such a small thing. A cup of coffee, placed without expectation, without drama, without any apparent awareness that it might be interpreted as anything other than the ordinary courtesy one person extends to another who is sitting nearby and might appreciate something warm. Ilsa picked up the cup. She drank the coffee. She said, in her careful English, "Thank you." Dorothy said sure, without looking up. Ilsa turned back to her typewriter and sat for a moment before beginning to type again. She was thinking about the word sure, about how Americans used it, loosely, easily, as a sound that meant of course, it was nothing. This is just how people treat each other. As if the act required no acknowledgement because it was simply what you did. She had been told these people had no manners, no civilization in the European sense of the word. She had been told their culture was thin and loud and self-interested, built on commerce rather than tradition, on appetite rather than principle. Dorothy Marsh was already on her second page of forms and had forgotten the coffee entirely. Ilsa filed this away beside the meal from the night before, the processing corporal's neutral efficiency, the guards who had not raised their voices. She was building something, methodically, the way she had always approached information that did not yet add up, collecting observations without forcing them into conclusions, waiting for the pattern to declare itself. She was not ready to name the pattern yet, but she could feel its shape beginning to form. It was on a Wednesday in the last week of September that the supply truck arrived. Ilsa saw it from the window of the administrative building, a large canvas-covered army truck that turned through the camp gate and backed up to the warehouse on the far side of the yard with the practiced ease of a driver who had made this particular delivery many times before. 2 soldiers jumped down from the cab. A third appeared from inside the warehouse. There were forms exchanged, a clipboard passed back and forth, signatures. Then they began unloading. Ilsa stopped typing. Crates came off the truck in a steady flow, wooden crates, cardboard boxes, canvas sacks that were heavy enough to require 2 men. The soldier from the warehouse counted each item against his clipboard, checked it off, pointed to where it should be stacked. Everything was organized, categorized, placed with the particular care of people who understood that a system only works when the parts of it can be found again. She could not see the labels from this distance, but she could see the volume. There were crates of tinned goods, stacked to chest height. There were sacks that moved and shifted the way sacks of grain or sugar move when lifted. There were boxes sealed with tape that the warehouse soldiers stacked separately, away from the others. There were, at the very end, several crates that one of the men opened on the spot to check the contents. And from the window of the administrative building, Ilsa could see the orange color inside. Fruit. Actual fruit. A crate of oranges delivered to a military camp in Indiana in September of 1945, with the same casual efficiency as everything else, signed for on a clipboard by a private who glanced at the contents, nodded, and pointed to where they should go. The whole operation took perhaps 20 minutes. Then the truck drove back out through the gate, and the warehouse door closed, and the yard returned to its normal rhythms. Ilsa sat at her desk and did not move for a long moment. She thought about the last winter in Stuttgart, about the weeks when the ration cards covered less and less of what a person needed and the gaps had to be filled with substitutes. Ersatz coffee made from grain, bread that contained things that were not wheat, meals planned around what was available rather than what the body required. She thought about the particular mathematics of scarcity that had become the background calculation of every day. How far would this go? Who needed it most? What could be cut without anyone noticing until they were too weak to work? She thought about how normal that had come to feel. And she looked at the closed door of the warehouse across the yard, behind which a crate of oranges had just been added to whatever was already there. And she felt something shift in the region behind her sternum. Not quite understanding. Not yet. But the first physical sensation of a belief beginning to lose its certainty. The way a wall feels when the foundation beneath it is no longer entirely level. Nothing has fallen yet. But something has moved. She turned back to her typewriter. She typed. She did not say anything to Dorothy, who would not have understood the question even if Ilsa had known how to ask it in English. How do you explain to someone that what they experience as an ordinary Wednesday, a supply truck, a clipboard, a crate of fruit, is, to the person watching from the window, a small demolition? How do you explain that the ordinary was the evidence? You don't. You just type. You just watch. You carry it quietly and wait for it to mean something you are ready to accept. That evening she wrote in the small notebook she had kept since leaving Germany. Not a diary exactly. More a record of observations. The habit of a woman who had always trusted written words more than spoken ones. Wednesday. A delivery arrived at the warehouse today. I watched from the window. I did not count the crates, but there were many. Fruit included. Oranges. The soldier who signed for them did not appear to find this remarkable. No one did. I find that I cannot stop thinking about it. Not the fruit itself. The absence of awareness that it was anything other than a routine event. That is what I cannot account for. She closed the notebook. She lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. She thought, the officers told us they were running out of everything. She had believed this because it had made sense at the time, because a country stretched across two oceans fighting on multiple fronts should logically be depleted by the effort. Because the exhaustion visible in German resources had to be mirrored somewhere on the other side. Because a war this large had to be consuming everyone. She was beginning to understand that she had made an error of symmetry. She had assumed that what was true for Germany was true for everyone. That the hunger and the scarcity and the rationing were universal conditions of the time, rather than specific consequences of specific choices made by specific people who had decided that certain things mattered more than feeding the nation they claimed to be protecting. She did not write this down. It was too large to commit to paper yet. But she felt it, sitting in her chest like a stone that had just been turned over to reveal what lived underneath. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning when the administrative building was closed and the women had unstructured hours, Ilsa walked the perimeter of the camp. Not because she was looking for anything in particular. Because walking helped her think, and she had a great deal to think about. The camp was not large. 15 minutes at a steady pace took her around the outer edge of the compound, past the barracks, past the mess hall, past the small building that served as a medical station, past the recreation room with its 2 windows facing the yard. She walked slowly, hands in her pockets, watching. She watched the American soldiers on their Saturday routines. Some were cleaning equipment with the methodical attention of men who had been taught that maintaining your tools was not optional. Some were playing a card game at a table outside one of the buildings, their voices rising and falling with the progress of the game. 2 were throwing a ball back and forth across the yard with the loose, easy motion of people who had no particular deadline and were simply enjoying the movement of a cool morning. One soldier, sitting alone on the steps of a building, was writing a letter. She could tell by the careful way he held the pen and the way his eyes moved between the page and the middle distance. He was composing, not just transcribing. Finding the right words for someone at home who would receive this paper and try to understand what a day in Indiana in September of 1945 felt like. She watched him for a moment without meaning to. He was perhaps 20 years old. Dark hair, a face that was still, in certain angles, the face of a boy not entirely finished becoming a man. He read back what he had written, made a correction, continued. His expression was private and concentrated, the expression of someone doing something that mattered to him, in the middle of an ordinary morning, because he wanted to. She thought about Friedrich. She thought about Friedrich writing letters, the ones he had sent from the front in the brief weeks before the communication stopped, the careful handwriting, the sentences that tried to say what he was allowed to say, without letting her know what he was not allowed to say. She had read those letters until the paper softened at the folds. She had carried them in her coat pocket until they were too fragile to unfold without tearing. The last one had arrived in February, 1945. A page and a half. He said he was cold, but managing. He said the men in his unit were mostly older and mostly kind to him. He said he had been thinking about what he wanted to study after the war. He said to give his love to the apartment, to the kitchen, to the particular window above the sink that caught the afternoon light. He said he hoped she was eating enough. He had been 17 years old and cold somewhere on a collapsing front, and he had written to ask if she was eating enough. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the yard with the September sky enormous overhead and the sound of the ball being thrown back and forth between the 2 soldiers and the scratch of the young letter-writer's pen, and she felt, for the first time since arriving, the full weight of what she was carrying. Not the uncertainty about where she was or what would happen to her. Those were problems with potential solutions. They would resolve themselves through time and the administrative processes that governed her situation. She could be patient about those. But Friedrich was a different kind of wait. Friedrich was the kind of wait that did not resolve. It only waited. It waited while you typed forms and drank coffee and watched supply trucks and walked the perimeter of a camp in Indiana. And it was there every time the movement stopped and the ordinary tasks ran out, and there was nothing left between you and the silence. She did not know if he was alive. She had not known for 7 months. 7 months of not knowing is a particular kind of endurance. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with the sharp clarity of loss or the relief of resolution. It is simply there, every morning. The first thing consciousness encounters before the day's ordinary demands provides something to do with your hands and your attention. It is the weight you carry while doing everything else. The thing you set down in no place, because there is no place to set it down. She stood in the yard and breathed. The young soldier finished his letter, folded it, sealed the envelope. He looked up and saw her standing there, and met her eyes for a moment. Not with hostility, not with the awareness of an enemy, just the brief neutral acknowledgement of one person noticing another in a shared space. Then he looked back down at the envelope and wrote the address. She walked back to the barracks. She sat on her bunk and took out the notebook. Saturday. I walked the perimeter. I watched the soldiers on their free morning, cards, a ball game, letter writing. No cruelty visible. No threat visible. No evidence of the brutality I was prepared for. I find that I must be honest with myself about what this means, even if I am not yet ready to be honest on paper. The evidence is accumulating. I am running out of explanations that preserve what I was taught to believe. She paused, then added, Friedrich would be 18 now. I do not know where he is. I do not know if he is cold. I do not know if there is someone kind in whatever place he finds himself, someone who sets a cup of coffee beside him without being asked. I think about that more than I should. The small kindnesses. The ones no one teaches you to expect from an enemy. She closed the notebook. Outside, the ball game continued. The sound of it, the clean crack of a throw caught cleanly, the brief voices of men with nothing to worry about on a Saturday morning, came through the window and filled the quiet of the barracks with the uncomplicated sound of people who were, for a few hours at least, simply alive and unhurried. She listened to it for a long time before she lay down. She almost did not go. The notice had been posted on the board outside the recreation room on a Thursday evening. A single sheet of paper, typed in both English and German, announcing that a voluntary Sunday morning service would be held in the recreation room at 9 o'clock. All were welcome. Attendance was not required. A chaplain from the army garrison would lead the service. There would be no obligation of any kind. Ilsa had read it twice, standing in the corridor with the smell of the evening meal still in the air, and then she had walked back to the barracks and told herself she was not interested. She was not a woman who had lost her faith exactly. It was more that faith had become one of the many things set aside during the war years, quietly, without drama, the way you set aside anything that requires more than you have available. The apparatus of the state had not been hostile to religion in the way some regimes were. It had simply occupied the space that religion used to fill, offered its own ceremonies, its own vocabulary of sacrifice and meaning and belonging, and the substitution had been gradual enough that many people, including Ilsa, had not noticed what had been displaced until the thing doing the displacing was gone. So it was not faith that took her to the recreation room on Sunday morning. It was something smaller and less dignified. The mornings had become difficult. The unstructured hours of the weekend, when there was no typing to do and no forms to sort and no practical task to occupy the hands and redirect the mind, were the hours when the weight of not knowing about Friedrich became hardest to carry. The recreation room would be full of something, voices, movement, the sound of a service progressing from one part to the next. It would be something to do with the hours between breakfast and lunch. She told herself that was all it was. The recreation room held perhaps 30 people when she arrived, a few minutes before 9. Most of them were American soldiers, young men in their Sunday dress uniforms, sitting in the rows of wooden chairs that had been arranged facing a small table at the front of the room. The table held a Bible, a wooden cross perhaps 30 centimeters tall, and a single candle burning with the steady, unhurried flame of something that had been lit in an unhurried room. There were perhaps 4 or 5 other German women from the camp, seated together toward the back with the careful posture of people trying to occupy space without drawing attention to themselves. Ilsa took a seat at the end of a row near the window. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the candle and waited. The chaplain arrived at 9 o'clock with the punctuality of a man who respected other people's time. His name, she would learn later, was Reverend Thomas Albright. from a small town in Kentucky whose name she would spend the next several weeks learning to pronounce. He was perhaps 50 years old, medium height, with the particular physical ease of a man who was comfortable in his own body and in his own convictions without needing to announce either. He wore his uniform the way men wear clothes they have stopped thinking about, correctly, without self-consciousness, the uniform simply being what you wore rather than a statement you were making. He set his Bible on the table. He looked around the room with the unhurried attention of someone genuinely glad to see who had come. His eyes passed over the German women at the back without pause or change of expression. Not with hostility, not with pointed warmth. Simply with the same acknowledgement he gave to everyone else in the room. The recognition of one person seeing another, in a space that had been opened for anyone who wanted to enter it. Ilsa noticed this. She catalogued it beside the coffee on the desk, the supply truck, the letter-writing soldier. She was still building her evidence. She was still waiting for the pattern to fully declare itself. The service was simple. Reverend Albright spoke in English, and a young corporal who had been stationed near the German women offered quiet translations in a low voice. Not complete sentences always, but enough to follow the shape of what was being said. A hymn, sung by the soldiers with the unself-conscious, slightly imperfect sound of men singing, because they meant it rather than because they were trained to. A reading from scripture. A brief reflection that Ilsa caught only in pieces through the translation, something about the nature of mercy, about how mercy was not the suspension of judgment, but the decision to act towards someone as if their worth were not contingent on what they had done or which side they had stood on. She was not certain she had understood correctly. Her English was still limited, the translation was incomplete, and she was aware that she might be shaping what she heard into what she was already thinking. She let it pass. She would not build too much on something she might have misheard. The hymn came again at the end, the same one as before, and this time she recognized the melody even if the words were foreign. It was the kind of melody that exists below language, in the older register where music lives before it becomes words, and she found that she knew the shape of it even though she had never heard this particular version before. Then Reverend Albright closed his Bible and looked out at the room. Before we close, the corporal translated quietly. The Reverend asks if anyone has something they would like the group to pray for. A person, a situation, anything you are carrying that you would like others to carry with you for a moment. A young private near the front raised his hand. His mother was ill, back in Georgia. He had received a letter 3 days ago and did not know how serious it was. He said it quietly, without embarrassment, the way you say something in a room that has been established as a place where such things are safe to say. Reverend Albright nodded. He wrote something in the small notebook he carried. "We'll hold her," he said. Another soldier, older, a sergeant with the tired face of someone who had been carrying something for a long time, said there was a friend. Missing in the Pacific since August. Still no word. The family had been notified but nothing had been confirmed. "We'll hold him," Albright said. He wrote it down. He looked around the room. His gaze moved to the back rows, to the German women sitting with their careful posture and their folded hands, and he did not look away. He did not make the moment pointed or political. He simply extended the same question he had extended to everyone else, his expression carrying the same openness it had carried from the moment he walked in. The corporal translated. The Reverend asks if anyone else has someone they would like the group to pray for. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It lasted a lifetime. Ilsa was aware of the other German women beside her, of their stillness, of the particular quality of silence that falls in a room when everyone is waiting to see what someone else will do. She was aware of the candle on the table, still burning with its steady flame. She was aware of her own hands in her lap, folded the way her mother had taught her to fold them in church as a child, in a Germany that had been a different place and a different time, and a world that no longer existed in any form she could return to. She heard herself speak before she had finished deciding to. "My son." The words came out in German. The corporal translated them into English, and as he did, she continued, slowly, carefully, in the halting combination of German and broken English that was the only language she had for things this large. "Friedrich. Was 17 years old. He was taken in the last weeks. I have not heard from him since February. I do not know if he is alive." She stopped. The room was very quiet. She was aware, with a clarity that felt almost physical, of what she had just asked. She had asked men who had fought against her country, who had lost friends and brothers and years of their lives to a war that Germany had started and prosecuted with a ruthlessness that had reached into every corner of the continent. She had asked those men to pray for a German boy who had been part of the force arrayed against them. The absurdity of it arrived a moment after the words, the way the cold arrives a moment after you step outside. She did not take it back. Reverend Albright looked at her for a moment. His expression did not change in the way she had expected, There was no hesitation, no visible calculation, no moment where he weighed the request against its origin and found it wanting. He simply wrote in his notebook, the same way he had written for the soldier's mother and the missing friend. Friedrich, he said, and the corporal rendered it back into German so she would know he had the name right. Yes, she said. We'll hold him, Albright said. He bowed his head. The room bowed its heads. 30 American soldiers, in a recreation room in Indiana, in the October of 1945, bowed their heads and prayed for a German boy they had never met, drafted into a war they had just finished fighting against him, missing on a front that many of them had helped to collapse. They did not know Friedrich. They did not know if he was a good person or a frightened one, whether he had fired a weapon or refused to, whether he had survived or not. They knew only what Ilse had said, that he was 17 years old, that he had been taken in the last weeks, and that his mother did not know where he was. That was enough. That was all Reverend Albright had needed to write the name down. Ilse sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes closed, and she listened to the room breathe. She did not hear specific words. Albright prayed quietly, the kind of prayer that was not a performance, but a private conversation conducted in a room with others rather than alone, the volume calibrated for sincerity rather than effect. She caught her son's name once, the syllables of it strange in an American accent, Friedrich, and she felt something move through her chest at the sound of it, at the sound of his name in this room, carried in the voices of these men, offered up to whatever was listening as if it mattered, as if the name of a German boy missing on a European front was something that deserved to be spoken aloud and held. She did not cry during the prayer. She held herself very still, the way she had held herself still at Friedrich's departure, at the telegram about her husband, at every moment in the past 4 years when the thing happening was too large for the space available to feel it in. The prayer ended. Albright said a closing word. The service was over. People began to move, the quiet shuffle of a room returning to ordinary time, chairs scraping slightly, voices resuming at a normal register. The young private who had asked for prayer for his mother caught Ilse's eye as he stood and nodded, not with pity, not with any complicated emotional message, just the simple acknowledgement of one person who had asked for something recognizing another person who had asked for the same thing. She nodded back. She did not cry until she was outside. The October air was cooler than it had been, carrying the first suggestion of what Indiana winters were apparently capable of, a dryness and a depth to the cold that was different from the wet cold of Stuttgart, more honest somehow, less interested in being subtle about its intentions. She walked away from the recreation room without direction, following the path along the edge of the compound, and when she had put enough distance between herself and the building that no one coming out the door would immediately see her, she stopped. She stood with her back to the fence and looked out across the flat fields and cried. Not loudly, not with the release of someone who has been waiting to break, more like the quiet, steady crying of someone processing information that has no other outlet. The kind of crying that is less about grief than about the structural failure of a framework you have been living inside for a very long time, and which is just, quietly, and without drama, given way. Because what had happened in that room was not compatible with what she had been taught to believe about these people. It was not compatible with savages. It was not compatible with men without honor or restraint. It was not compatible with a country that was the enemy of civilization and order and everything a serious nation stood for. It was not compatible with any version of the story she had been handed, any variant of the official truth she had inhabited for the better part of her adult life. A man from Kentucky had asked God to look after her son. 30 American soldiers had bowed their heads and held Friedrich's name in a room in Indiana. They had not been told to do this. They had not been required to extend the prayer to the German women at the back. Reverend Albright could have looked at the back rows and simply moved to the closing without offering the question, and no regulation would have been violated, no principle compromised. The choice to extend the same invitation, the same will hold him, written in the same notebook, in the same unhurried handwriting, was a choice made by a man operating according to something that had nothing to do with nationality or victory or the categories of wartime. She stood against the fence and let the tears run and looked at the flat October fields and thought about that. About what it meant that the framework she had lived inside, the one that organized the world into those who deserved consideration and those who did not, those whose suffering mattered, and those whose suffering was the acceptable cost of a larger project. What it meant that this framework had just been undone not by argument, not by force, not by any confrontation she had been prepared for, but by a man writing a name in a notebook and saying we'll hold him in the same tone he used for everyone else. She had been told America was a country without values. She was standing in the evidence of a country that had simply chosen different ones. One she had not been permitted to see clearly until now. Ones that, from where she was standing, in the October cold with the tears drying on her face, felt less like the values of an enemy, and more like the values of a world she had not known she was missing. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She breathed. She thought, Friedrich, wherever you are. Someone said your name in a room full of people who had every reason to wish you harm and chose instead to wish you well. She held that thought the way you hold something fragile. Carefully, with both hands, aware that it could break if she was not careful, but unwilling to set it down. That evening she opened the notebook. She sat in the barracks with the lamp on the small table casting its yellow light across the page, and she wrote for a long time, longer than she had written since arriving, longer than any single entry in the notebook she had kept since Stuttgart. Sunday, October. I attended the service. I did not intend to say anything. I did not intend to be anything other than a person sitting in a chair, occupying the hours between breakfast and lunch. I said Friedrich's name. A man from Kentucky wrote it in a notebook and said he would hold it. 30 soldiers bowed their heads. She paused. Outside, the camp had settled into its evening sounds, distant voices, a door closing, the particular quality of a large building full of people quietly ending their day. I have been trying to find an explanation that does not require me to revise everything I believe. I have been collecting evidence for 3 weeks with the intention of building a case that what I am seeing is surface only, performance, calculated kindness, strategy designed to weaken the resolve of prisoners. I have been looking for the moment when the mask comes off. I have not found it. What I have found instead is a man who writes the names of German boys in his notebook beside the names of American mothers and missing friends, and sees no distinction worth making. She stopped again. She looked at what she had written. I do not know what to do with a country like this. I was not prepared for a country like this. None of what I was taught included the possibility of a country like this. She closed the notebook. She lay down on the bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about Reverend Albright writing Friedrich in careful letters while 30 soldiers waited to bow their heads. She thought about the world she had been raised inside, its certainties, its categories, its careful architecture of who mattered and who did not, and why the distinction was necessary and just. She thought about how long she had lived inside that architecture without seeing it as a choice, the way you live inside a building without seeing its walls as walls. She thought about what it meant that the first crack had not come from argument or evidence or any rational confrontation she had been equipped to meet. It had come from a name written in a notebook. It had come from "We'll hold him," said in the same tone for everyone. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed about Friedrich. Not the last morning, not the pack too large for his frame or the stairs or the way he had looked back. She dreamed about him at 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in Stuttgart with his biology notebook, drawing the chambers of the human heart with the focused, serious expression he brought to everything he loved. She woke before dawn with the dream still vivid. She lay still in the dark and listened to the camp breathe. Somewhere in Europe, in a holding camp or a ruined city or a field hospital or a place she could not imagine, her son was, she hoped, lying in his own dark, breathing his own air, perhaps dreaming his own dreams of kitchens and notebooks and the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of a life that had been interrupted by forces neither of them had been given the power to refuse. Hold him, she thought, to no one and everyone at once. Please, whatever you are, wherever this goes, hold him. She found the book on a Tuesday. Not because she was looking for it. She had gone to the recreation room in the early afternoon to return a German-language almanac she had borrowed the previous week, a practical document, full of agricultural calendars and weather tables and the kind of information that had no emotional weight, which was precisely why she had chosen it. She had wanted something to read that would not require anything of her. The almanac had provided exactly that. Columns of numbers, planting schedules, the average rainfall in various German regions across various decades. Information without consequence. She set the almanac back on the shelf and ran her finger along the other spines. There were American magazines, Life, Saturday Evening Post, issues from the past several months with their bright cover illustrations and their confident headlines. There were 2 English-language novels she could not yet read well enough to attempt. There were several German-language publications, newspapers, a Protestant hymnal, a thin volume of Swiss poetry that someone had left behind and that had no obvious explanation for its presence. There was a German-language Bible, worn at the spine, the kind of Bible that had been opened many times over many years. And then, between the Bible and a stack of Red Cross bulletins, its spine pressed slightly inward as if it had been replaced in a hurry or simply by someone who had not been paying attention to the order of things. A novel. Dark blue cover. The author's name printed in the plain typeface of a pre-war German edition. Thomas Mann. Der Zauberberg. The magic mountain. She did not move for a moment. She stood with her finger touching the spine and felt something that was not quite recognition and not quite fear, but lived in the space between them. She knew this book. She knew it the way you know something that was present in your life and then suddenly, without announcement, was not. The way you know the shape of an absence. She had owned a copy once, in the years before the war, when she had been a young woman in Stuttgart with a small apartment and a shelf of books that represented the person she had been before the person she became. She had read it at 23, sitting in the kitchen with the window open and the summer coming through, and had found it slow and dense and magnificent in the way that things are magnificent when they take their time with you. Then the lists had come. The lists of books that were dangerous, that contained the wrong ideas, that had been written by people who could not be trusted to understand what Germany was building and what it required. The lists came first, then the collections, then the burnings, not everywhere, not all at once, but steadily, with the patient thoroughness of a system that understood that ideas lived in objects and objects could be removed. She had given her copy away before they came for it, to a neighbor who was leaving for Switzerland. She had told herself at the time that she was being practical. She had not allowed herself to think about what it meant that practicality had required her to surrender a novel. She took the book off the shelf. She held it in both hands and looked at it the way you look at something you expect to be confiscated, with the particular attention of someone who knows they have limited time, who wants to see as much as possible before the thing is taken away. The cover was slightly faded. The pages, when she opened to the first one, had the soft, slightly yellowed quality of paper that had been read before. Someone had read this book in this room, had set it back on the shelf, had walked away. She stood there and waited. She was not certain what she was waiting for. The instinct was old and deep and entirely automatic. The instinct that said that holding something like this in a visible place, in a room accessible to authority, was a thing that required an explanation and perhaps an accounting. The instinct that had been built into her over a decade of living in a world where certain ideas were dangerous and the objects that carried them were treated accordingly. No one came. A soldier passed the window outside. A door opened and closed somewhere down the corridor. From the yard, the sound of a vehicle engine starting, running for a moment, stopping. No one came into the room. No one appeared at the door to ask what she was holding and why. She looked down at the book in her hands. She opened it to the first page. Ein einfacher junger Mensch reist im Hochsommer von Hamburg nach Davosplatz, im Kanton Graubünden. A simple young man traveled in high summer from Hamburg to Davos. She read the sentence twice. The German was clean and unhurried. The German of a writer who was completely comfortable taking his time, who trusted the reader to stay with him through the long, deliberate unfolding of what he wanted to say. She had forgotten how much she loved that quality in a sentence, the confidence of it, the refusal to rush. She read 2 more pages standing at the shelf. Then she carried the book to a chair by the window and sat down and read for 2 hours. No one came. No one entered the room to tell her to stop. No one appeared with a list. No one checked what she was reading against a register of permitted materials. No one stood in the doorway with the expression of a person about to make an administrative intervention. The corporal who occasionally looked in on the recreation room opened the door once, glanced around, saw a German woman reading a book in a chair by the window, and closed the door again. That was all. She read until the light began to shift toward the afternoon. Then she placed the book back on the shelf, spine aligned with the others, the way you treat something that belongs, and walked back to the barracks and sat on her bunk for a long time without doing anything else. She was thinking about what had just happened, not the reading. The reading was simple, the pleasure of a good sentence encountered again after a long absence. She was thinking about the architecture of the room she had been sitting in, about what the shelf represented, about what it meant that this book existed in this place without a lock on the door or a list on the wall or any system for determining who was permitted to encounter what ideas. She had grown up inside a different architecture, one that began with the premise that certain thoughts were capable of causing harm, not through any action they might inspire, but simply by existing in a mind that was not equipped to handle them correctly. The conclusion drawn from this premise was that access to such thoughts had to be managed, supervised, restricted to those who could be trusted to understand what they were encountering and respond to it in the approved way. Everyone else, which was to say, almost everyone, required protection from the ideas that the managers of culture had determined were too dangerous to circulate freely. She had accepted this premise. She had accepted it so completely that she had stopped experiencing it as a premise. It had simply become the shape of how knowledge worked, that someone above you in the structure understood which ideas were safe and which were not, and that their judgment on the matter was more reliable than yours, and that trusting this arrangement was a form of responsibility rather than a form of submission. The shelf in the recreation room had no such arrangement. It had a Bible and a hymnal and a Swiss poetry collection and a stack of Red Cross bulletins and a novel by a German writer who had been considered dangerous enough to ban, and all of these objects coexisted on the same shelf, accessible to anyone who walked through the door, with no mechanism for ensuring that the right person encountered the right material under the right supervision. The country had not collapsed because of this shelf. The soldiers who used this room had not been corrupted by the proximity of ideas they were not equipped to handle. The corporal who had glanced through the door and seen her reading had not felt it necessary to inquire into the contents of what she held. The shelf simply existed. The books simply sat there. And whoever wanted to read whatever was available simply could. That evening, Renata, the former clerk from Munich who had been Ilse's closest companion since the transport, the woman who had said, "Don't eat too fast" on the first evening in the mess hall, noticed that something had shifted. They were sitting together after the evening meal, as they often did, in the small space between the last barracks building and the fence, where a wooden bench had been placed at some point for reasons no one could explain, but which provided a useful place to sit when the barracks felt too enclosed. The October air was cold enough now to require the heavier coats that had been issued the previous week. Another practical gesture, another ordinary administrative decision that kept running into Ilse's accumulated evidence and refusing to fit the framework she had been given. "You look like you've been thinking hard about something," Renata said. Her German was the German of a Munich childhood, slightly different in rhythm from Stuttgart's, and Ilse had grown fond of it over the weeks. Fond of the small regional differences that reminded her that Germany was a large place full of specific people rather than an abstract entity making abstract demands. "I found a book today," Ilse said. Renata waited. A banned book. On the shelf in the recreation room. Just sitting there. Between the Bible and some Red Cross papers. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then, "Which one?" "Man. The Magic Mountain." Another pause. "I had a copy of that," Renata said. "Before." "So did I." They sat with that for a moment. The particular shared understanding of two women who had lived through the same erasure of the same library, who had both learned to carry the absence of certain books as a background condition of ordinary life, so routine that they had stopped noticing it until the presence of the thing pointed to what had been removed. "Did you read it?" Renata asked. 2 hours. "Did anyone say anything?" No one said anything. Renata looked out at the yard. A light had come on in the administrative building across the compound, yellow through the window, someone working late or simply occupying a lit room because they could, because electricity was not rationed here, because the lights came on when you needed them, and there was no calculation required about whether the need justified the cost. "I've been trying," Renata said slowly, "to find the place where they are what we were told they were. I've been looking every day. I look at the soldiers and I wait for the thing underneath the politeness to show itself. I wait for the real version." And, Ilse said, though she already knew the answer because she had been conducting the same search with the same result. "I think this might be the real version," Renata said quietly. "I think this might actually be what they are." The words settled between them in the October air. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. She went back to the recreation room on Thursday, and on Saturday, and on the following Tuesday. Each time she took the book from the shelf and read for as long as the afternoon allowed. She was reading slowly, not because the German was difficult, but because she wanted to stay inside the sentences, wanted the experience of being in a text that was not asking her to be a particular kind of person or hold a particular kind of loyalty. The novel asked nothing of her except attention. It rewarded attention with the quiet pleasure of a writer who had spent years learning how to mean things precisely, and who trusted that precision was a form of respect for the reader. Between sessions she thought about what the book represented, not the content. She had read it before, and the ideas in it were not new to her. What she thought about was the fact of it. The fact that it was here, on this shelf, in this country, available to anyone who came through the door. The fact that the people who ran this camp had apparently seen no conflict between operating a military detention facility and maintaining a shelf of reading material that included works prescribed by the government their prisoners had served. She thought about what that meant. About the kind of confidence required to operate that way. The confidence of a society that trusted its people to encounter ideas without collapsing, that believed the open circulation of thought was not a threat to order, but one of the conditions that made genuine order possible. Not the imposed order of a structure that managed what its people were permitted to think, but the durable, self-sustaining order of people who had been trusted with their own minds, and had therefore developed the capacity to use them. She had never lived inside that kind of confidence. She had lived inside the other kind, the kind that expressed itself as protection, that framed restriction as care, that said we are managing this for your benefit, and had relied, successfully, on the fact that when everyone around you accepts the management, it stops feeling like management and starts feeling like the natural shape of how a responsible society operates. She thought about Friedrich and his biology notebooks, about the questions he used to bring to her kitchen table, careful, curious, genuinely interested in how things worked, how the body maintained itself, what happened at the cellular level when something went wrong. About how that curiosity had always been his most recognizable quality, the thread you could follow from the boy he was at 6 to the young man she had last seen at 17. She thought about what kind of country would have been good for Friedrich. What kind of country would have let that curiosity go where it needed to go, without a list of what it was and was not permitted to encounter, without a structure deciding in advance which questions were safe and which required supervision. She looked at the book on her lap. She looked at the shelf with its uncurated, unlocked, unremarkable collection of available thought. She thought, he would have liked this room. On a Friday afternoon, near the end of October, she was reading in her usual chair when Reverend Albright came into the recreation room. He was not there for a service. He simply came through the door with a small stack of books under his arm, crossed to the shelf, and began replacing them one by one with the careful attention of a man who had been returning borrowed books to a shelf his whole life and had developed a set of private principles about spine alignment and ordering that he applied without thinking. He noticed her as he was placing the last book. He said something in English that the translator was not there to render into German. But she had enough now. Enough weeks of working beside Dorothy Marsh. Enough Sundays in the recreation room. Enough accumulated immersion in the ambient language of the camp to catch the general shape of it. Something like, you come here often. Not a challenge. Not an observation designed to establish authority. The mild, conversational tone of a man making a small observation about a pattern he has noticed. She said, in her careful English, I am reading the book. She held it up so he could see the cover. He looked at it. Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like a quiet recognition, as if the book's presence on the shelf had been intentional rather than accidental, and she had just confirmed something he had wondered about. He said something else, slower this time, aware of the language gap, calibrating his words to what she might be able to follow. She caught, good book, long. He, the writer, left Germany. 1933. She nodded. She knew this. Man had gone into exile the year the list began. Had spent the war years in Switzerland and then in America, writing and broadcasting, and refusing to be silent about what was happening to the country he had left behind. She knew this the way she knew many things she had never been officially permitted to know, through the gaps, through the things that leaked past the management of information despite the best efforts of those doing the managing. Albright looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say the next thing. Then he said, slowly, in the deliberate English of a man making sure he was understood, no one will take it from you. While you are here, you can read whatever is on that shelf. She looked at him. He was not making a political statement. He was not delivering a lesson or pointing to a contrast or inviting her to draw conclusions about the superiority of one system with its shelf that had no lock, where a book the old order had declared dangerous sat between a Bible and a Red Cross bulletin, available to anyone who walked through the door, because no one here had decided that its citizens needed protection from ideas. She wrote about the Sunday service. She wrote it slowly, with care, the way you handle something that matters. There is a chaplain here, a man from Kentucky named Albright. He holds a service on Sunday mornings, and at the end he asks if anyone has something they want the group to pray for. On my first Sunday, I was sitting at the back. I had gone only because the mornings are difficult, and I needed somewhere to be. When he asked the question, I heard myself say your name before I had finished deciding to. Friedrich. I told them you had been taken in the last weeks, and that I had not heard from you since February, and that I did not know if you were alive. He wrote your name in his notebook the same way he wrote the name of a soldier's sick mother and another man's missing friend. Then 30 American soldiers bowed their heads and prayed for you. She stopped and looked at what she had written. I want you to understand what that means, Friedrich. These were men who had fought against us. Men who had lost people to this war. People on the other side of the line from where you were standing. They had every reason to feel nothing for a German boy they had never met. Instead, they bowed their heads. Not because they were ordered to. Not because a regulation required it. Because a man from Kentucky thought it was the right thing to do, and no one in that room disagreed. She paused again. Outside, the Indiana night was fully dark, the stars the same impossible abundance she had noticed on her first evening, the silence the deep, uninterrupted silence of flat land with nothing to break the wind. I have been here for nearly 2 months. I came prepared for what I had been told to expect, a brutal country, exhausted and resentful, looking for ways to punish the people it had defeated. I have been looking every day for evidence of that country. I have not found it. What I have found instead is a mess hall where the food does not run out and a shelf where the books are not forbidden, and a man who writes the names of German boys in his notebook and says we will hold him, and means it. She set down the pen. She picked it up again. I am not telling you this so that you will love America. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know what I have seen, and because you are going to come home to a Germany that will need to be rebuilt from the foundation up, and because the question of what to build it from, what values, what principles, what understanding of how a country ought to treat the people inside it, that question is going to be the most important question of your generation. Think about the shelf with no lock. Think about the man who wrote your name down. Think about what it means when a country trusts its people with ideas, when it treats the dignity of a person as something that does not expire when that person is on the losing side. Think about what kind of Germany you want to build for your children. She folded the letter. She addressed the envelope to the Red Cross forwarding address printed on the notice from that morning. She sealed it. She held it in both hands for a moment. This paper that carried Friedrich's name from one side of the world to the other, that carried the prayer and the shelf and the cup of coffee and the crate of oranges, that carried her to draw conclusions about the superiority of one system over another. He was simply telling her a fact about the room she was sitting in. A fact that he apparently felt was worth stating plainly, in case she did not already know it. I know, she said in English. Good, he said. He straightened the last book on the shelf and left the room. She sat for a long time after he left. The book was open in her lap, but she was not reading. She was thinking about what he had said, and more specifically about how he had said it, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating a rule that had never been in question, that required no justification or defense. That was simply the way the room worked, because that was how rooms ought to work. No one will take it from you. 6 words. Said the way you say the mess hall opens at 7 or the infirmary is in the building on the left. Information delivered without drama because it was simply true. She had spent 12 years living in a country where those 6 words would have been impossible. Not because no one had thought them. People think all manner of things that they are not permitted to say or act upon, but because the architecture of the society made them unutterable as fact. In the Germany she had grown up in, the sentence "no one will take it from you" applied to a carefully managed subset of objects and ideas. Outside that subset, taking was not only possible, but systematized, institutional, conducted according to lists maintained by people whose job it was to decide what could and could not remain in your hands. She had accepted that architecture as the reasonable shape of a serious country's approach to its own coherence. She had accepted it so thoroughly that she had helped maintain it, had attended the meetings, had submitted the forms, had raised her son inside it, and told him that the restrictions were protections, and that protection was a form of love. She closed the book carefully. She held it on her lap for a moment with both hands. Then she got up, crossed to the shelf, and placed it back in its position between the Bible and the Red Cross bulletins, spine-aligned, available to whoever came next. She walked out into the October afternoon and stood for a moment in the cold air and looked at the flat Indiana fields and the enormous sky and thought about the word available, about what it meant to live inside a world where that word applied without qualification, where the shelf had no lock because no lock was needed because no one in this country had decided that its citizens required protection from Thomas Mann. She thought about Friedrich. She thought about what she would write to him when the Red Cross finally told her where he was. She thought about the shelf, and the prayer, and the cup of coffee set down without ceremony, and the supply truck unloaded without drama, and the soldier writing a letter on a Saturday morning, and all of the accumulated, ordinary, devastating evidence of the past 6 weeks. She thought, I have been trying to find the place where they are what we were told they were. I don't think that place exists. The Red Cross notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. It came through the camp administrative office, processed and stamped like everything else. A single typed sheet placed on her desk by Dorothy Marsh, who set it down with the quiet care of someone who understood that certain pieces of paper required a different kind of handling than forms and requisitions. Ilse looked at it for a moment before picking it up. Then she read it. Friedrich Baumann. Holding facility, British occupation zone, Northern Germany. Health status, stable. Malnourished, but receiving treatment. Expected release within 3 to 4 months, pending standard processing. She read it twice. Then a third time. The way you read something when the meaning is too large to absorb in a single pass, and you need the repetition to make it real. Stable. Malnourished, but receiving treatment. He was alive. She set the paper down on the desk, and pressed both palms flat against the surface and breathed. Dorothy, at the desk beside her, did not say anything. She simply reached over and placed her hand briefly on top of Ilse's, one quick, warm pressure, then withdrawn, and went back to her work. Ilse sat for a long moment with her eyes closed. She thought, someone said his name in a room in Indiana. 30 men bowed their heads. She thought, hold him, please. Whatever you are. Something had held him. She wrote the letter that evening. She sat at the small table in the barracks with the lamp on and the notebook open, and she wrote without stopping, the words coming with the particular urgency of someone who has been carrying something too long and has finally found the right hands to place it in. She wrote about the camp. Not the fences, or the administrative procedures, or the physical conditions. She wrote about the things she had not expected. The cup of coffee set down, without ceremony. The mess hall where the food was real, and no one calculated how far it needed to stretch. The supply truck and the crate of oranges signed for on a clipboard by a private who found nothing remarkable in abundance. The recreation a country be, quietly, and without announcement, what it said it was. Then she set it on the table to be posted in the morning, and turned off the lamp. In the dark she thought about home. About what it would look like when she returned. The rubble she had heard about from other women. The city reorganizing itself around its own damage. The long, careful work of rebuilding something from what remained. She thought about her mother. About the apartment above the street in Stuttgart. Whether the window above the sink that Friedrich had asked her to greet in his last letter was still there. She thought about what she would carry back with her. Not the camp. Not the captivity. The forms, the gray-green work clothes, the fence that was an administrative boundary rather than a punishment. Those things would fade. The texture of days fades. What stays is the understanding that certain days produced. The slow, irreversible shift in what you know to be true about the world. The kind of knowing that cannot be undone because it was built not from what someone told you, but from what you saw with your own eyes and heard with your own ears and felt with your own hands. She would carry the shelf. She would carry the notebook. She would carry 30 men bowing their heads in a room in Indiana for a boy they had never met, because a man from Kentucky thought that was simply what you did when someone asked. She would carry all of it home to a country that had forgotten, or perhaps had never fully known, what it looked like when a people actually believed the things they said they believed. Not in speeches, not in official ceremonies, not in the managed language of a state constructing its own image, but in the ordinary Tuesday morning of a cup of coffee set down, without ceremony. A book left on a shelf without a lock. A name written in a notebook in the same hand as everyone else's. She closed her eyes. She slept.